Yeah, everyone, to INA's Collective Expertise webinar series. We are so happy to have you joining us today. I am Julie Morgan, INA's administrative assistant, and today we have the pleasure of hearing from INA's first vice president, Krista Nader. Krista is a lifelong learner curious about the newest educational techniques, including anti-bias, education, and gender equality. Originally from Erie, Pennsylvania, she earned her BA in early childhood education from the University of Texas, Arlington. After working as a nanny and a teacher in public and private Montessori schools, Krista found a nanny agency called Kith and Kin in 2016 in New York City. In 2020, Krista joined Kith and Kin with a nationwide nanny agency called Adventure Nannies, where she presently serves as a placement counselor. She presently sits on the board of directors of the International Nanny Association, and she has been quoted in the New York Times, CNN, and has previously spoken at several conferences and seminars for expecting parents, nanny industry leaders, and yoga practitioners. She can often be found practicing yoga, hiking with her family, reading a book out back, chasing her dogs in the park, or cycling down the beach, now with a handmade mask on her face. Since 2009, she has made her home with her husband and two pups, and they currently reside in Brooklyn, New York. Today, she will be joining us to discuss cultural shift, cultivating authentic and inclusive change in your business. Halfway through 2020 and knee deep into the unimaginable pandemic, new challenges and old patterns have boiled to the surface, causing us at times to doubt the strength of our perseverance and confront the limits of our understanding. Finding ourselves in the midst of one of the largest, most important social movements of our time has many of us questioning our role and responsibility as companies that profit off of the labors of individuals, the majority of whom are Black and Hispanic women. How do we truly support equality within our walls beyond posting trite images of a Black hand and a white hand grasped together? How can we bring our personal commitment to anti-racism and equality into our professional world? Considering the historical foundations of domestic work in the United States, today we are going to explore its residual present effects, and in turn utilize this knowledge to explore your company's capacity to bring an integrous enactor of equality for all applicants. We will also discuss concrete ways to help our agencies meet this moment in history with grace, empathy, boldness, and honesty. Time for questions will be given afterwards, so we kindly ask that you remain muted until then, but please feel free to ask any questions in the side chat bar. All right, Krista, I'll let you take it from here.
Hi, Julie. Hi, everyone. Good to see you all here. Some of you I see, but fully aware, thank you, that it's a pandemic, and I don't know if any of you still wear makeup or put on anything but tank tops and shorts, like I am in my un-air-conditioned house. So this feels like a big day for me. So if you want to turn on your camera, I would welcome that. That's completely fine and no judgment from me. So I'm just glad you're here today, and yeah, I'm excited. If you have your camera on, I was going to ask if anybody was in. I gave a kind of a part one of this presentation at the INA conference back in March of 2019, and then at APNA in October of 2019. I tweaked it a bit and went a little bit deeper, had more time. It was the keynote. It was just a little different. So if you were there, the first part of this will be a little bit similar to that. But really the intention has changed a bit, and we're updating it for, as the prompt says, we're finding ourselves in this really interesting, awful, challenging, heartbreaking time, and we really are struggling. I don't know about you, but struggling to find our role and our kind of responsibility as a company that, not my company, because I'm no longer an owner, as Julie said, but I think in general, just all corporations are going through this fact of what do we do and how do we respond, and really truly support equality within our walls. And I put posting a trite image of a black and a white hand clasped together because that seemed to be, one of the only ways that we knew how to respond. And so how can we bring our own personal commitment to anti-racism and equality into our professional world? That's the question I think we're answering today. We're going to first consider the historical foundations of domestic work, the present residual effects, and then turn it into an ability to explore your company's capacity to be an integrous enactor of equality for applicants, meaning what you do with integrity, that's dispersed throughout your whole company, what you do in private. And then we're going to discuss some concrete ways to help our agency meet this moment in history, as Julie said. And yeah, so I always put this in there, ready yourself. Ready yourself to be challenged and uncomfortable and introspective, honest, supported, and empowered. Those are really important things because ultimately, anytime we have new information, it gets emotional, it gets tight. Even if it's not new information, it's just we've heard it a lot. It tends to have an effect at different points in time. So yeah, I think we should just get started. I think for me, if you know anything about me or all of that, I do this thing called story time. I've done it since the beginning of the pandemic, and it started on my personal page, and now it's transitioned over onto my business page, the company that I work at called Adventure Nannies. And because I am a teacher at heart, I like to give people the roadmap of knowing where we're going to go and what we're covering. And so revisiting this kind of rubric, I guess, if you will, there's no judgment there, but that helps us to kind of clear our plates and our mental desktop as well. So just what people on video, I have 2 fans on right now, and I do live in the city and I have the windows halfway open. Can you hear me okay, or should I put my headphones in? Yeah, what do you think? Joy is making like a but okay. If it's like, I could do it and I bet it will improve the speaker. So I will try that and we'll see if that works. But anyway, so point is, while we get started here, if you want to take a moment and just turn off the do not disturb, turn that on your computer, that's great. If you have a pen and paper handy and you want to take notes, I completely welcome you to do that. Now, maybe, can you hear me? No, yes? Maria says yes. Okay, fabulous. So yeah, this is just kind of the part where you give yourself permission to keep your mind where your body is, right? Our mind is extremely active, it's crafty, and its job is to help us to not forget anything at all, but it also has needs and wants. And so I think in this time, just kind of like clear out. When do we really take a break? And I want also to just encourage you to remember that a feeling is just that. It's a feeling, it has a beginning and it has an end. And it's not necessarily a fact. It's just an impression or a response to something being done or felt or spoken or in front of you. And so there's a lot of feelings that have arisen at the start of this pandemic, right? I don't know about many of you, but I know a lot of businesses lost clients overnight, and a lot of nannies lost jobs overnight. And then we're in this stressed out time where everything is kind of going wild. And then we have on camera a man, again, being murdered in the street. And that elicits even more emotion to this stage of time that we're in. And we all have feelings about these things. And so I think that if your feelings arise, knowing that you have them and identifying them there's no shame in that. Just practice staying present. And these are our practices, right? It's staying present mentally and physically to the best of your ability. Acknowledgement. So we're acknowledging we have different backgrounds. We're coming with curiosity and openness to challenge the labels and biases we hold, right? I don't think that you would be here if you didn't already have these practices in place for yourself. And the last one is just self-reflection, avoiding the exception Olympics, right? Turning that mirror to ourselves to self-reflect at a point in time, we'll get there. So, but before that, I just really want to acknowledge that we are all doing our very best right now. You are really showing up with curiosity and openness already today. And I think that that's already commendable. I would like to encourage you though, if something pierces you, as I'm sure it will, because I am assuming you're a kind and compassionate person, let it, it's okay, but feel free to just take a note of it and investigate it later so you can be here with us still. So where we're gonna start off our time here together is with a little bit of history. History tells us how we got here. We don't exist in a vacuum. And we're going to take just a little bit of time to learn a new thing or two, or maybe stuff you already knew. Before we start that, I want to just visit this quote. And it's by Ijoma Eloho. I practiced her last name. It was Nigerian. And she wrote a wonderful book that is changed my life a couple years ago. It's back on the bestseller list. It's called So You Want to Talk About Race. And she writes, no matter what, when we're having a hard conversation about racial oppression, these conversations will always be hard because why? They are always going to be about the hurt and pain of real people. We're talking about our identities. She is a Black woman, and she's saying that we're talking about our identities and our histories and the ways in which these are used to exploit, to elevate, and to oppress. These conversations will always be emotional and loaded, and if they are not, then you are likely not having the right conversation. And so I like to keep that in mind when I visit history, because the next few slides are pretty challenging and they're pretty tough. So without further ado, let's get tough. So paid domestic work, we know, was always around prior to the time before slavery, right back to when the land was first colonized, and indigenous folks were captured and forced to work for the Europeans who came over. However, when our country started to grow, our forefathers started to enable slavery to exist, and that changed things even further. They wouldn't pay for people to do the work that they could have others do for free, because they didn't even view them as people, they viewed them as property. So between 1815 and 1860, the United States started expanding west, colonizing what was native land and the northern reaches of Mexico. And so they started taking captive Mexican persons for domestic help as well, while simultaneously encouraging and facilitating the immigration of Asian men to help build the railroad from the east to west coast, okay? So then the Emancipation Proclamation happens, the Civil War ends, and people of color, Black folks, were finally free to make a living and participate in the American dream. But they were left with very limited opportunities, and in some contexts, no opportunities beyond the work that they were already forced to do for generations. And so what happened after that time, before Jim Crow laws came in, it was a controlling system was created called Black Codes. And these were applicable specifically to freed men only and women, which determined where they could go and when, where they could work, who they could talk to. It barred them from receiving public education and in certain public spaces, being sold an alcohol, knife, gun, any of that, and they would be fined for not having a job. So if any of these people had broken any of these Black codes, these new laws, they were sent to labor camps back into the fields, which, think about it, it looks like slavery with a different clothing on. And so if they had a job, it was often back on the plantations where they were freed from, and that is not really because of anything else but a lack of opportunities. They were often not paid in money. They were paid in vouchers that could only be used at the plantation store, which kept the money and the wealth still in the context of the people who enslaved them. So while they were free, like I said, this is just slavery in different clothes, okay? And so I'll just show you kind of some images here. You can kind of see at the top there, this is people who were imprisoned. And so in short, African American, and then after that, 1890s, that's when Black codes evolved into Jim Crow laws. So in short, African American, Mexican, and indigenous people who were finally legally recognized and as people instead of property, they were forced back into the work really that they were doing domestic work and laboring in fields. So it was almost a given. Domestic work was almost a given for both men and women, except now they were able to be paid for that work. There was also in 1882 the Chinese Exclusion Act, which was passed to bar future immigration of Asian people for the next several decades out of fear of their power. So we know this. This is an icky part, right? Something that I have heard is, oh, I like this image of an old Southern grandma. And really what that is rooted in a racist stereotype called the mammy figure. I'm sure some of you have heard of it. It's idolized after the antebellum period. And basically what this context here is saying is that she was created as manufactured evidence that a Black woman was happy to be enslaved and that slavery was a humane institution. She was desexualized, she belonged to the white family, and this was like her life work. And there have even been, there was even in the early 1900s, a statue that some white folks wanted to erect to pay respects to this image and the history. And that did not go over so well, understandably, because it's really just a token. And it's really just a way to keep this image in place. So we see it all the time in pop culture and also Aunt Jemima, right? That actually is not a thing anymore. When I last gave this presentation, it was a thing. And I saw people say it's erasing history and we're honoring Black women. But we have to remember, does a Black woman whose ancestor was Aunt Jemima, does that person actually own Aunt Jemima? Do they profit off of that? And if not, that's where it's just, it has nothing to do with that person, and that person is not profiting. It's extremely hurtful, it's a stereotype, and it is offensive. And it's racist. So that's where we are. Now, when we go into the 1900s, all of this is what led a lot of people of color to go north. And some of the northern states, obviously they had laws in place as well. And as immigration came from Europe, there were a lot of people from Ireland and Germany and Scandinavia, and they had a significant portion of the domestic labor force in the Midwest and Northeast. But one important distinction is that for native-born immigrant and immigrant white women, domestics, primarily it's women, this was seen as a temporary occupation that you would engage in prior to marriage. Whereas women of color, which is African American women, Black Americans, Native Americans, Latinas, and Asian women, they worked as a domestic often out of necessity even after they had their own families. But in the 1920s, there was a large curtailment of immigration. And basically, when there was a drop in domestic workers, at the same time, Black women domestic workers rose from 28% to 60%. And this is in the, like I said, 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s. And this is really why we have such a hard time legitimizing our industry as real work, because we're still feeling the effects of the baseline, which was we're taking people that aren't seen as people, they're seen as property to do the work that we don't want to do. And it gets perpetuated over time. And there's very limited opportunities. So again, this is, some racist imagery here, which is, history. I just want to make it clear though that, take a drink, that domestic workers were not poor, oppressed, uneducated people who were easily pushed over. They often risked being fired just by speaking up for themselves. And so I want you to understand that the domestic workers are the ones who sustained the Montgomery bus boycott that brought us to where we are here. It lasted 381 days, and it was a major spark in changing our history. This is incredible. And here are some examples of the women, including the timeline of really how this happened in sequential order. It was really the Women's Political Council. And they had been talking about this for some time. Claudette Colvin was a student. She was the first one to actually refuse to give up her seat on the bus. And Mary Louise Smith also did that. And then the straw that broke everything was, as we know, Rosa Parks. And then that set it all off. And this is just also personal, amazing woman. She is a Dorothy Bolden. She is a domestic worker from Atlanta, and she asked Dr. Martin Luther King for help, and he said, "You do it." And so she did, and she started one of the largest official advocacy organizations called the National Domestic Workers Union of America. And she was out there on the buses every day and talking with domestic workers, talking with nannies and housekeepers, and telling them how to negotiate schedules and rights and wages, and that's incredible. And the KKK would threaten her, and she told them anytime they wanted to, they could come on over and grab it, which is incredible. And I like to say, like, straight fire, like, no fear. She's just amazing. She lives in the face of adversity, and she brought us to where we are now. So very quickly, just some present day statistics. This is from a study that was done in 2011, 2012 by the National Domestic Workers Alliance. And so you can glance over that real quick. Think about when you're reading these stats, this is 9 years ago, how this shows up in the context of a pandemic and what's happened to a lot of nannies, right? Think about the live-in part. Now everybody wants a live-in nanny. So they can keep an eye or not take public transportation or control off time. And these are just stats on wages across the board by immigration status. Now, like I said, this is several years old. Wages definitely have gone up. It depends on your market. But I think it's important to just kind of notice by immigration status, and even, this is not broken down by race, but just how that plays out. Cool. All right. And then the last bit here, in 1974, the Fair Labor Standards Act, FLSA, was modified to include only minimum wage requirements for domestic workers, except for casual babysitters and home health aides. Before that, the Fair Labor Standards Act excluded domestic workers and farm workers. Now, why do you think that is? Well, slavery, right? Those were the people in the beginning of when labor acts started. They were excluded because people could not, the white people who were in power making the laws could not think of giving power to the people who were working in their own homes. So right now, bottom line, there's just still very little protections for domestic workers. It's getting better. Obviously, things are always getting better. We're working towards progress, but that's where we are now. So these are some things: safe working, too many clicks, safe working conditions, paid sick time, overtime, severance, affordable healthcare, childcare, a minimum reliable salary, even though they're hourly employees. They want savings for emergencies and retirement. We're in an emergency right now. And we look at the stats, how many nannies do not have savings? And so the domestic work industry is structured in ways that undercut the capacity for workers to exercise their rights. This is from the same study. And it's organized around atomized relationships in which workers have no communal power, and the work itself disappears from view into a private space, right? So we have a system of laws and legislation that if you don't look too closely, it passes for actual equality. And we're seeing it, not just in the domestic world, we're seeing it on May 25th when George Floyd was murdered, and the Black Lives Matter movement, a human rights movement, not a political one, went worldwide, and we had major demonstrations. Because we're seeing that we have these laws on paper, and they pass for equality, but the iniquities when we draw back that curtain are very subtle and legal and can be reasoned away with broad generalizations about social groups that peer-reviewed research doesn't support. So let's chat about the present day. I appreciate that the world is collectively waking up to the iniquities that Black people face, not just in America, but around the world. And people are saying Black Lives Matter everywhere. We don't have a ton of time to dive into that, but odds are you're here because at some point within the past 6 years, since this movement started, your eyes have been open to the way that systemic racism and our own individual personal biases have harmed and killed Black people or other people of color. And we're here now, knowing the history and knowing the lack of protections our nannies face, and hearing and reading the discrimination in which families are legally allowed to operate under, because discrimination laws and that sort of thing only apply to a certain, if you have a certain amount of employees. So we're hearing all these things, and then we're somehow caught in the middle of this, trying to figure out how to personally change and grow, and then have our companies respond thoughtfully. And so while all of this stuff is heavy and important and serious, humor is light and necessary. I like to use humor not to make light of a very serious situation, but to, in a way, keep from crying, keep from feeling, yeah, I don't know. There's a woman named Joy. She's an incredible singer and musician, and she made this wonderful video that I'd like to share. Wave if you cannot hear it. Okay. We're going to do this. Can you hear me? Okay, you can hear me. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually just cancel this real quick and start again. Hold on 1 second. Share computer sound. Optimize screen share. Okay. Now. Here's. No? Yes? Haha, I love it. Okay. So let me figure out real quick how to restart that. Here we go.
Graphic design is the cure to racism. Graphic design, it will make the world fair. Here's a white hand and a black hand and we put them together. Graphic design, hey, look over there.
Right? Look over there, it's cured. Oh, thank God. Okay, we did our Instagram post. We did it. I have to confess though that this webinar is not in any way of how to craft a suitable response to the killing of George Floyd or Tony McDade or Breonna Taylor. These here are George Floyd's last words. And they're flown over 5 US cities, orchestrated by a Black male artist from Louisiana named Jamie Holmes. I mean, how on earth does an individual, let alone a nanny agency, respond to his murder and the pain of another person whose life, potential, parenthood, stance, voice, personhood was robbed from us and robbed from themselves and their family? Like, can you imagine, like, if Breonna Taylor was able to live another 70 years, as she should be? And it's not just these murders, but people are waking up to the continued pattern of systemic racism and injustice that goes on day in and day out, inside and outside of our walls. And then I imagine that you're here because you want to know how to respond and grow and change just like me. And I'm going to put these back in for the microphone's sake, so no more videos. But there is a teacher, a gentleman that I follow. He's also a neighbor, oddly enough, and Ebony P. Donnelly. And he says that, well, you know, he's glad, most people are glad that people are waking up to injustices. And they're saying how grateful they are to Ebony and his partner, Erica, for teaching and shedding light and day in and day out processing some of these things. But he very frustratedly asked, you know, at what cost? You know, at what cost does my education and the world's education about these injustices that we've known for centuries, and we see, at what cost does it, what cost is it? Because I know that most teachers express gratitude. They appreciate it when gratitude is expressed. But understand that it would be better to not have to educate, for us to not have to do, not me, but for Black educators to not do this. And they'd rather that than have Elijah McClain gone, and Natasha McKenna, and Nia Wilson, and a teenage neighbor of mine, Kimani Gray. Like they would rather have that than there be like a flood of anti-racism books on the New York Times bestsellers list. And so it comes at great cost, and we are all here going, okay, I'm here now. And I want you to understand that I'm not some kind of official diversity trainer who is like paid large honorariums, selling out lecture halls, like chatting about oppression and systemic racism as like a white woman. I think that if all we can do is listen to a white woman because it's more palatable to us, then that's a problem. And if you want to know how to respond in these situations, go listen to Stephanie Bachman's series about Nanny and Well Block. She's done incredible interviews and panels with incredible individuals in our industry. There was an INA webinar last week with her and Kyuta and Jasmine about racism they've experienced on the job. And go listen to the Abner webinar from several weeks ago that 4 Black agency owners gave, Erica and Ruka and Dominique and Lisa. And it's really important that I appreciate that people show up for me, but I view this as a shared learning. I can't speak to the experience of what many of my Black friends and Black folks around us are going through. I can't, but I can shed some light on my perspective. And so a lot of this will be my opinion, but I think you're here for that perspective of me, who's been waking up for years. And many of you are as well, and have been, and I love to see it. So the point of this is not vulnerability. It is vulnerability, and it's not virtual signaling. These are just some things that have worked for me. These are all the things that I've learned from the harm that I've caused, and the ways that I've learned for us to do a little better. And so, welcome, 30 minutes in. I'm really glad that we're doing this together, because it's work. So first of all, we want to change the agency. We want to respond well. We know the history. Our personal values equal our agency values. So I don't own a business anymore, but ultimately, if we want our businesses to show up and make change and display our commitment to anti-racism, it's not through, just social media. It's not through a blog post. It's not just through more Black people's faces and BIPOC faces on your feeds. And it's certainly not the white hand and the Black hand put together and like, look over there. What really matters is the unseen work. And we must decide where we stand personally when it comes to racism and turning a blind eye, even when our clients call in with things and they say, we just view them as a preference. We have to look at the racial demographics of our staff, our pool of nannies, and seriously keeping metrics on these sorts of things about how many people overall applying are of a certain race and making it through your process, just as a point of reflection for us. So what can we do right now to be the agency that is welcoming and supportive of candidates from all social groups? Like, okay, Krista, like I get it. Like the world's awful. This is so much. Like I haven't done enough. I feel guilty. I feel shame. Like I have a lot of those feelings. And I never feel like I do enough, like ever. But I know like we do what we can. And here are some things. But before we go there, 2 words, prejudice, discrimination, commonly used. I want you to understand they're not equal. They don't mean the same thing. Prejudice is a prejudgment about another person based on the social group that they belong to. Our prejudices are often similar because we tend to be homogenous in our social circles, in the neighborhoods that we live in our schools that we grew up in. We lack exposure. So all of us have it. So, we can't play those exception Olympics, and try not to feel shame that you have it because, like I said, we all do. Discrimination is when we just allow those internalized prejudices to determine our actions. But then specific types of discrimination have a distinction because, like sexism, racism, ageism, anti-Semitism, it's whenever a historically oppressed group is treated differently by an organization that holds authority or power, like a government, like a social club, like a business, like ours, that's when we think about racism being systemic and not just about an individual discriminating. Does that make sense? Like, I know you like, no one wants to discriminate. I think there's several people that do, but the point is, it is a system, and it's when an organization holds power over an individual. So these are common social groupings, age, weight, talked about that, but just for clarity's sake, this is what I'm referring to when we talk about social groupings. So why do I bring them up at all? Because, you know, when conversing with a person, we should totally treat them all the same, right? Absolutely. We should really notice our own prejudice as it comes up in our hearts, because we all have it. We've already discussed that. I hope we're all agreeing. But what I found within myself and others is usually kind of the opposite. We'll mentally and verbally say things like, well, I don't care that, you know, I didn't even notice. Like, you know, we notice age, we notice weight, we notice race, we do. And I think that we just try to convince ourselves that we're better than that by not acknowledging that we've noticed things that are just plain as day. And so Dr. Robin DiAngelo, she wrote, this is from her book, White Fragility. And she wrote, regardless of our protestations that social groups don't matter and we see everyone as equal, we know that to be defined as a man by the dominant culture is a different experience than being a woman. And we know that to be viewed as old is different from being young, rich, different from poor, able-bodied, being different than having a disability, gay, different from being homosexual, and so on. And then we also know that it's better to be in one of these groups than it is to be in its opposite. And so better is in quotes because, of course, that's subjective to opinion and location. And it's the reason we'll say to someone, you know, oh, you look so skinny, instead of like, oh, you look so fat, because socially, we're socialized to prefer certain things. But to deny a person their recognition, your recognition, excuse me, of their social group is like denying a part of their existence. And we're denying what it means to experience life in their particular body. And that is what brings us to colorblind-ness. It's a phrase I grew up knowing, and it's a philosophy. So colorblind-ness is, full stop, it's just the racial ideology. This is from Dr. Monica Williams. It's the racial ideology that posits the best way to end discrimination is just by treating individuals as equally as possible without regard to their race, culture, or ethnicity. At its face value, colorblindness seems like a good thing, really taking MLK seriously on his call to judge people on the content of their character rather than the color of their skin. It focuses on commonalities between people such as their shared humanity. These are great things. This is not a bad thing. However, colorblindness alone is not sufficient to heal racial wounds on a national or personal level, and it's only a half measure that in the end operates as a form of racism. That's a big word. So basically, I want you to understand that colorblindness is the phrase, all lives matter. It's that phrase in action. That's what it means. Because of course, all lives matter. All lives should matter to us. All lives should matter to our agencies. All nannies should be treated equally. And we should listen to MLK and say that we will assess and judge people on the content of their character when we're doing nanny interviews, of course. However, there's a flaw in that because, well, I won't say too much. I'll keep going. In a society, in a colorblind society, white people who are unlikely, and this is, I bolded that, unlikely, to experience disadvantages due to their race, because of the race, can effectively ignore racism in American life, justify the current social order, and feel comfortable with a relatively privileged standing in society. So this doesn't mean that white people have not experienced prejudice or discrimination based on their light skin or ageism or anti-Semitism. Absolutely, absolutely, I've experienced discrimination and prejudice. But what is true for most white people is that in the broader context of society, our lives aren't made more challenging because of our skin color. Our resumes aren't passed over for jobs because of our white sounding name. Most of the successful sitcoms in the past 30 years are centered around white characters with maybe like a black person in the periphery or some black character to entertain, or a Hispanic housekeeper that's so funny and doesn't speak English. And that is what we talk about maintaining social order. And if this all sounds a little far-fetched and dumb to you, completely understand. Here are some stats collected by our government, and I'm happy to provide you the sources. So Black people are 3 times more likely to die in childbirth than white people. We're talking about Black people in general still being the minority, percentage-wise, of total US population. Black children are 500% higher death rate, more likely. Black people are 2.8 times more likely to die at the hands of police, which is what Black Lives Matter is centered around. And Black people have higher rates of diabetes and hypertension. Those are just a few things. Right, so, and Black children are 3.1 times more likely to drown than white children because of access and advantages. These are stats. So most minorities, however, will regularly encounter difficulties due to race and experience colorblind ideologies very differently. Colorblindness creates a society that denies their negative racial experiences, and it rejects their cultural heritage and invalidates their unique personalities. So I don't really want to be a part of that society. I really don't want that to be a part of the agency that I work with. And so before I can become an anti-racist agency or an anti-racist person, I have to examine the ways I operate under colorblindness. Because if colorblindness creates that society that their negative racial interactions aren't real, and we can just say it's not real, I see everybody the same, I will bypass the experience of those who are not white like me, because I'm white, last time I checked, right? So I have to examine myself before I can act. And that's all the time. This is continually. Like, I'm not done just because I've read some books and I've given some lectures and I have Black friends, like actual Black friends, right? Like on my iPhone feed, right? Like, I mean, it's not, there's no passing this. It's really and always an internal reflection. We must acknowledge someone as they say they are before we can advocate and change on behalf of them. We don't tell them who they are. We just affirm their identity. And we know that it has shaped their experiences, and we acknowledge it, their humanity, and that it might be different than our own. So that's where we're at. I mean, it would be like trying to advocate for nannies without acknowledging that someone is a nanny. Like, can you imagine that? Like, if we're like, well, nannies, live-in nannies are whatever some of the statistics, right? Like 40% less likely to have, domestic workers are 40% less likely to have savings. And then somebody came in and was like, well, all workers are less likely to have savings. Well, that's the truth. And there's some intersectionality there for sure. But we are focusing on the conversation at hand, which is becoming an anti-racist agency. And so when we call for justice for Breonna Taylor, like, we've got to acknowledge that she was a Black woman whose life was taken and then deemed a justifiable murder by our government so far. But we have to acknowledge someone as they are. We don't have time for this. I'm sorry. And the sound of the word. All right, so let's talk about tokenism real quick. Tokenism, it is defined as the practice of making only a perfunctory or symbolic effort to do a particular thing, especially by recruiting a small number of people from underrepresented groups in order to give the appearance of sexual or racial equality within a workforce. It's to give the appearance. That's what tokenism is. It's like, here's some coin your way, like that gift, right? Like, here's some coin. I'm not going to change my processes. I'm not going to have hard conversations. I'm not going to hire someone who's from a different cultural background from me because that might be uncomfortable. Like, tokenism is much more comfortable, you guys. And it's easier to post a white hand and a Black hand together than it is to change internally. And that's just the truth. Erica Slade, she's a fantastic agency owner in Tulsa, Oklahoma. She said on the ACNA webinar, and something that pierced me, I was taking notes. I love taking notes. Always take notes because something will hit you and you'll forget it. But she said, in the context of the conversation when we were talking about Black Lives Matter, is not a political movement, it's a human rights issue. Erica essentially said that, you know, posting a response can be your thesis and roadmap for change, or it can be a Band-Aid to receive some notoriety or praise. And I went, yeah. So hear her on that. I will never, ever know, and frankly, I don't need to know if any company's statement is genuine. It's not up to me to judge. We will see if this behind the scenes work is being done to give equal opportunities, respect, a seat at the table, a voice in decisions and justice in the next few years. Like, we will soon see if all lives matter. So I preface this by saying, please do not shy away from representation. Have Black and brown faces on your feeds. I think it's important. Elevate the voices of people who typically aren't elevated. Do that. But make sure you give them a seat at the table. Make sure you give some power. And don't worry about being judged if it's tokenism or pandering, because it will feel like that and you will be judged. You will be judged. That's okay. It's okay for someone to judge you because I have a package being delivered apparently. Their opinion of you has really nothing to do with you. So someone's opinion of what you're doing doesn't change what you're really doing in your heart. It doesn't change your efforts. So I want you to remember that. And also, just be aware of your own virtue signaling. I put these creepy gifs because we should be afraid. You know, virtue signaling is just super uncomfortable, and we have all sorts of feelings of shame, like I was talking about in the beginning. But you'll see a lot of corporations or individuals virtue signaling, and that's to say, like, I'm virtuous. Here I am. I'm Krista Nader. I'm giving this webinar. I'm great, right? But you'll see where they have no people of color on their boards, no Black speakers at their events, no BIPOC leaders writing content visibly. They'll be ghostwriting, and then often somebody else will take credit for that. But then they're the first to chime in and condemn everyone and everything for being racist. And so if you're just waking up to it, own up to it. Like Ebony Donnelly says, tell on yourself. You don't have to throw shade on everyone else, but just be true to yourself. And if you're awake and you've been aware, how are you fighting and advocating? How are you committed to the cause? Because I'll be honest, the anti-racism work, it's hard. And I got burned out and I was sleeping. I was sleeping when the movement came back. For a couple months, I was just withdrawn. I think we all are in the pandemic, but we're all trying to survive. But I'm just saying, whatever you do, you don't have to tell anybody. You can just do it with integrity. So it starts with awareness of your own prejudices, own biases, ignorance. We're getting aware. And then the messages, right? The subconscious imagery that we're talking about. Representation does in fact matter. Representation tells our clients also what our agency is about and who our needs are. And connection, whether we like it or not, you know, our biases inform our interactions. So we need to connect. You need to connect with your candidates in diverse social groupings, learn their history, perspective, listen to Nannying While Black, get different perspectives, and be committed to reading work from writers and journalists who are different social backgrounds from you, right? So the lawmakers decide what is important for children to know in schools. And when I was little, the people who were in power were people pretty much, you know, from my social grouping. And the history and the education that I got was really about my European ancestors and tended to really, and still happens, if you watch Abraham X. Kennedy discuss this on CBS, he's a writer who wrote How to Be Anti-Racist and Stamped from the Beginning and Anti-Racist Baby and all these things. If you listen to him talk about history and education, it's still happening. We are still watching over the history of those who are indigenous to the US. And we know very little about their stories. And we're still watching over those who were enslaved. We still call them slaves, which can dehumanizes them. They're enslaved people. They're people who were kidnapped. They're not slaves. It's a different mental image. And so if I want to know about my candidate's history, I have to learn them. And I have to ask rich, honest questions. You know, maybe like, knowing the history of domestic workers. What would you like us to do to help protect your rights? To help protect you? Because if I want to run a company where 54% of domestic workers do not identify as white like I do, and 46% were not born here as I was, 46%, I have to work on decentering myself a bit. So the next thing is getting clarity. And that's clarity for your nannies and your families and the minimum requirements of your agency to be accepted in, both candidates and clients, and then also in the vetting and interview process. Right, so if clients are saying things to you that are coded or overtly sexist or racist or ageist or any of that, it's really important that you are clear because that's the kindest thing you can do. And that's what it is, kindness. I mean, and I'm talking about extending real kindness to people, empathy, love, that person who you love in your life, who loves you, your parent, maybe it's a parent or a child of yours, or a partner, or spouse. Think about that person that you love. You want to think about how they navigate the world and how people treat them. Treat others how you want the person you love. The person you love so much to be treated and understood and heard. And that's how we start to change. So basically, nannies need to know that they are cared for and protected by agencies who will insist that the discrimination and injustices of the past are not going to be repeated within our company's doors. It's history, but it's present. And they shouldn't have to guess. And it's not just tokenism, it's not just virtual signaling, it's not just representation, it's not just colorblindness. It's everything coming together to start to undo some of our patterns. Because being nice does not equal being kind. Niceness can be a form of pandering, just keeping the peace. So to reflect, we can't change what we can't see, so we have to look at ourselves, right? I've heard it said that we don't believe what we see. We see what we believe. Like guilty, 100% guilty. That's why research and statistics matter. But I think it is really important that we be objective with ourselves as agency owners. And you don't have to turn your mics off for this part. Absolutely would not do it. It's so weird giving a presentation where I can't hear anybody. I feel like I'm in my closet or in my bathroom, and I don't like it. So I hope you're doing okay. You've made it this far. So like, if you're not on camera, or even if you are, I always do this in my story time with my kids, and the kids I read to, and the adults I read to, because let's be real, it's like mostly adults. I just like give myself a hug when I'm feeling like stressed. And that tension in my body, like that compression I feel like cared for when I feel overwhelmed. You can use it when you want to. Here's a question. It's rhetorical. Well, it's not rhetorical. It's not rhetorical. It's a personal question that you reflect on later. It's just, what are the areas in my own personal bias of a person's race, their age, their weight, gender expression, education level? Like, how does that influence my agency's interview and vetting process? So whether you have staff or not, remember, like, your values are your agency's values. And the people you hire are reflecting your values and the values of your agency. So we just reflect on that. These are some questions that I'm a really strategic person because I don't have time, and who has time for anything? But then when I do have time, like, I waste it, which is fine. It's self-care also. But I think that if you really want to dig into these things, there will never be time to reflect unless you make it. And you're not going to be able to reflect on all the things and change all the things in a week or a month or a year. To be vulnerable with you, I mean, I think I've been on my own anti-racist journey, thinking that of course I wasn't racist, but then realizing that I've been socialized under racism, and of course I was and am, and some of my thoughts are supporting the system of this. It's been 6 years and I still grapple. And so don't think like, woo, when I went to this webinar, we solved racism, it's amazing. But think about these things. Do I apply an assumption of good faith evenly, or do I give certain social groups the benefit of the doubt more often than others? And you can also flip it, right? Like, you can say, like, well, I notice that I'm digging into this nanny of this background a little bit more. But like, am I digging into the background of everybody else evenly? Like, do I verify that the references aren't related for everybody? Or is it just like that? You know, is it just me? I told you it was going to be messy. It's not fun. It's uncomfortable. It's not fun. So are the steps in my vetting process intentional? Are they clear to my staff, and fair to candidates who meet our baseline requirements, right? Or is my process kind of unevenly applied, requiring me and my staff to just rely most on our gut and our intuition? I like intuition. I believe in it. My Myers-Briggs is highly intuitive. But what do I need to refine? Like, I'm aware that I use my intuition a lot, and I think it's helpful. But what do I need to refine to make it clear and accountable to myself that, you know what, my gut, because of my socialization and my prejudice, can be racist, it can be ageist, it can be all these things. And I don't want that in my agency. I don't want that in my community. And here's my question, to be vulnerable, because I am, if you study the Enneagram, I'm not fully convinced I'm a 9. My boss and friend might disagree with me. But am I more concerned with being a peacekeeper rather than a peacemaker? And yeah, I think that's a deep thing for all of us, because who likes conflict? Who likes conflict other than someone like my cousin who's a lawyer and like will argue anything and will go there? And I want to be more like her, right? I think that having hard conversations, focusing on being kind to the people who need it most instead of just nice, like I'm a nice lady, like we want to focus more on making peace and making the world more equitable and peaceful and filled with justice. So are we okay having uncomfortable disagreements that might turn into arguments, that might lead into periods of silence and hurt feelings and time to cool off? Are we okay with that? And we can have those hard conversations, but the bottom line I want you to think about during the pandemic is, like, if your agency is not strictly enforcing legal pay with all this influx of new people who are like, I don't have daycare anymore, and can a nanny like be paid $5 an hour? Maybe, like, I think that many of us are seeing an influx of clients who might not actually be our target client. But if we're not insisting that they build in, if they build in to their budget taxes, like, guess what? See this list? Unemployment, laid off, fired, the family's moving away out of the city because it's, you know, a cesspool or something, or like they need more space or whatever. Like, you know, credit, workers' compensation if they're injured on the job, protection and if they're audited, and then ultimately access to the CARES Act if they get coronavirus or their family member, and what's it called? Family leave. Someone in their family gets hurt or injured or sick. Like, if they're paid on the books, they get these things. And so all of you who show up today, we all mean so well, but we have to the extent possible, during a pandemic when a lot of us are just trying to hold on to our business. So I have absolutely no judgment for us trying to close placements. But I will say, we are profiting off of the labor of most often people of color. And it's really important that we protect every single person, because all lives do matter, right? Like, of course they do. We need to protect one another, and we need to insist that these injustices stop with us. Unaffordability, like, has very little to do with your agency. Everything is unaffordable, and we need to be advocating and lobbying for affordable healthcare. Affordable healthcare. If you like can't see that blazing out of my ears, because of coronavirus. Like, of course we need affordable healthcare, but we need affordable childcare, because the world is imploding in America without it. And this is my opinion. Take it if you like it. If you don't, that's okay too. Right? Not everything can land. But that's really what I think if we want to be an anti-racist agency, we really want to grow, what we need to do this. And this is my bookshelf, some of my books. I have a lot of recommendations. If you ever want them, you want to shoot me an email, you want a handout, happy to provide that. And that's it. That's the end. We did it, you guys. I said it. We solved racism. We're all good. We never have to do. I don't mean to minimize the message. I just know it can be heavy, and I know that we can feel discouraged sometimes. And I also have to laugh a little bit that we are in 2020 still going there. It's important work. So let me. I also don't like webinars that you can't look at the person who's speaking. I feel like it's really boring. So I'm sorry that the format is a little bit wonky. It's 3:30, and that means the webinar is officially over. But from the talk that I did at INA and APNA, and this doesn't have a client portion in it. This content is easily multiple presentations. So I am available for the next 30 minutes if you want to do a Q&A. I do not have all the answers, but like I said, I will share some resources, my opinion, my perspective, and then that way, if you have anything, drop it. I see there is a chat. Oh, I didn't see all these. Crystal, that's a very good point. I'm sorry, the chat didn't even pop up for me. Oh, I hope you're still here. Feel free to drop a question or unmute yourself. I'm happy to have you. But Kim, Crystal, Tamara, and another Kim, and Kenda, excuse me, many of the year nominees. Nice to see you, and Christina, and Eva, and Whitney, and Amara, Lisa, Monica, Jacqueline, and Shenandoah, and Maria, Rachel, and Joy, and Crystal. My sincere thanks. It was so good to have you here. I wish we could be in person, and come over to my house anytime you want when it's over, okay? So, the end. I don't know. I don't know. If, but yes, feel free to unmute yourself if you need to go. I feel like we can learn from each other. Crystal, are you trying to, you were waiting, oh, she was waiting. Or you can also private message me if you would like to be anonymous. I also want to honor that, you know, it's recorded and not everybody would like to be acknowledged, and but you are safe and free to send me a message. Rachel wrote Dreamland Burning is also a great book. Rachel, I feel like I've heard the title, but I know literally nothing about it, so I would like to write that down. If Rachel, will you, if you can, I don't know if you're in a place to unmute, but would you want to like give us like an overview real quick and the author of that?
I can Google the author. I can't
don't worry.
remember the name right now, but it's young adult lit. So, and it's historical fiction. It's awesome, and it gives a lot of the messaging that you're talking about in a story type format in a way that is, I think, boiled down to a good level, because it's young adult lit, where they're heavy messages, but they're delivered in pieces so that you can kind of get there rather than it being in your face immediately. And like you said in the history books, I never knew this happened until I was an adult. I can't believe I didn't know it happened, but I didn't.
Do you mean there's a lot I didn't know. I'll say to tell you what I didn't know, which this has been researched for like many years, like 2 years I've been into this specific domestic work, but I didn't realize FLSA excluded farm workers and domestic workers. I didn't know black codes were even a thing. There was so much, and I wanted to like spew it onto everybody all the time. It's such a, there's so much that is not in history. What were you referring to?
So I did look up the author just now. It's Jennifer Latham, and it's about, see, and now because I'm on the spot, I can't remember, the town in Oklahoma, outside Tulsa, the Black sort of part of Tulsa, which was its own town and was very much the center of Black commerce, that was leveled. And I can't believe I didn't know it in history books. So anyway, it was a really great book to illustrate what it would have been like to be on the white side and the black side then. And then there's a modern component to the white side and the black side now. So it was interesting. Anyway, I didn't mean to hijack anything.
Yeah.
It was just good. I know how much you like to read, especially, you know, young adult and children's lit, so.
Oh, I love young adult. Like, I'll just like, yeah, absolutely. No, that's, yeah, during like the Tulsa race riots, and you talking about Black Wall Street.
Yes,
Okay.
which the name of the town itself is just escaping me, unfortunately.
Yeah, Tulsa, where Eric was from. Yeah.
Yes.
I'm like, oh,
Anyway, I'll mute myself again now.
thanks, Rachel. There is an anonymous question that says, how do you address with a colleague that you're concerned about their actions potentially being considered discriminatory? I think it varies based on what social grouping, what race you're in, the response. I really do. I think that I can't, and I would be curious if there are any BIPOC people still on the call right now to say how they would maybe do it too. Like, I don't have all the answers, but I will say, like, for me, as a white woman, if I noticed that a colleague was doing something that was potentially considered discriminatory, I think it's hard when you are colleagues and you're not friends, right? I mean, you might be. I mean, I hope that we are, and I hope that it's friendly. But it's also, there's a level of good faith that might be lost with colleagues, and it depends on the culture of the company. So if it's a really buttoned up, formal, white glove type of company where, you know, staff, I heard on the other webinar where, like, they referred to nannies as inventory, and I thought that was problematic. But if you have a company that is, their function is a little bit more metrics, numbers, seeing people as just deals to close and forcing people into, like, there might be a culture there that is not super open to, I don't want to say correction. I would say guidance. I would say humility. I would say not humiliating, but having an open dialogue. Let's assume that you work for a company you agree with and support, and you align with your values, and the culture there and the level of communication is open. And yeah, I think full stop, it always needs to be addressed, no matter what it is. It needs to be addressed. And I think that in general, things are addressed privately. No one likes to be called out. And I promise you, if you call somebody out in front of other people, you're going to have the exact inverse reaction. Either the person is going to recoil and hate you, which is okay for them to do. They're entitled to their feelings. But that's not the goal, for them to recoil and pull away from you and never talk to you again. The goal is to communicate change. So either they'll do that, or it will turn into anger and it will blow up, which is often, from what I understand and what I've read and heard, that on diversity committees in companies are a lot of tokenism and a lot of performative nature, because when a Black person or a person of color, of races, that was actually problematic, that's really racist, and I'm feeling this, there's often a lot of bypassing, denying, declining. And it becomes more harmful, particularly the person who was harmed, to speak up. And that's why I say, like, as a white woman, I'm comfortable speaking up, because I know that it's not just about I should, it's kind of like the least that I can do, right? The least that we can do as people who operate under a system that is pretty dominant with because obviously we're the majority in the country as well, but also from the foundation of the country. Like, if I'm in this dominant class where my voice is more palatable and it's easier to listen to me or a man, like whatever it is, it's the least that we can do is to speak up and to privately consult with the person and say, hey, I mean, this is what I would say, because like I'm a peacemaker, and I feel sometimes I do too much pandering and I'm not as direct, so take this as it will. I will say, I know that you you're not racist, right? Like I wouldn't say that because I don't believe, whatever. But I would say, I know that you mean well. And I know you might not have intended for this to sound this way. And I know that, or I know you're really just trying to keep our company, safe and make sure that our candidates are being better or whatever. Like if they are, the question was, their actions are being considered discriminatory. I would say then, no, you don't mean that. Or I know that might not be your intention. However, it appears, or it could appear as though this, or that is discriminatory because, and then give a little bit of background information, right? Give a little bit of context to that of why it is discriminatory. I think that it's like the sandwich method: positive, hard, meaty stuff, and then positive. And nobody likes this, Tom. I know that you didn't mean well. I mean, I know you didn't mean any harm. Like, we don't want to pander. We want to be clear and kind. And so it's important for me, because obviously you can see, like, I am a verbal processor and like I talk way too much. Sometimes I will write down for myself so I don't lose track and I don't get talked out of my message. I'll write down like 3 sentences that are the core things for me, and then I'll memorize them and I'll commit that to my memory. So I start with that positive thing, I affirm them, and check in, how are you doing today? If you're not in a good spot, it's not the time. But then I'll come back to it, and then I'll say, like, I notice this is happening. And I know you might not mean this, but from my perspective, I'm concerned that it is this, or it could be construed as this. And what is the intention? And how can we get to your intention in a way that's not discriminatory, that it applies evenly across all people, right? So if the intention of the discriminatory action, when let's say a certain person is, I don't know, being Googled excessively, but then somebody else is Googled for 5 minutes, or someone has run a background check at a certain stage, but this other person is not. It would be pretty important to just, again, go back to those processes and say, like, oh, well, I appreciate you wanting to keep children safe. I appreciate you wanting to make sure that the client does not have a nanny who hasn't been vetted. I appreciate that. And I agree. Like, I'm always trying to find something to agree with, because ultimately, like, we're all socialized under this system. So it's often that the person's discrimination is not trying to be actively racist or harmful or discriminatory. It's that it is, and it's often indirectly. So yeah, it just depends on the context, depends on the situation, but I think that it ultimately does need to be spoken up for. And then conversely, with that, alternatively, if you also witness if you're witnessing someone who is being discriminated against in your office, or there's a microaggression, which is like a small thing that's like, makes your skin crawl a little bit and is not cool, or is undermining, or is talking down, or is not the way that someone else would be treated. That's how you can often tell. It's totally appropriate to call it out kindly in the moment, but if that makes the other person uncomfortable, I would not do that, because they're already uncomfortable. But if need be, go privately to that person and say, hey, what I'm learning and what I've read, and I don't have all the answers, but what I'm learning, what I've read, is that this specific behavior or action or comment is actually quite harmful, and it's hurtful. And I know that you don't want to hurt anybody, and I know that you're a considerate person. Sometimes it's like, name it and claim it. Have you heard that before? Like, name it and claim it. Like, you know, the person might not be considerate. Like, we're not all considerate. I used to be a horrible, inconsiderate person. Like seriously. But I think, like, telling people what they are and their potential, and how, like, call them out and tell them who you want them to be. Like, we do that with children, right? Like, you do that with children. We're not talking down and you're such a da, 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 da. You're positively saying to the child, I know you can make a better choice, right? That's what we want our nannies to do. We want our nannies to speak to our children like this. Like, I know that you think better than that. And so that's kind of the way that I just would frame it. Yeah, so that's me. And you do not stand by when someone's being discriminated against, especially when they see it, because they will know. We're talking about company culture. Like, that's a clear sign. That's a clear sign that that their culture and their experiences are not being respected. That maybe you don't believe that the company believes that Black Lives Matter, even though they put a statement out, right? We want to be genuine and true, and that's having those hard conversations. Does anybody have anything to add? Okay. Anonymously, as a nanny, how can I know if a prospective family is politically and philosophically compatible, especially about racism issues? I happen to be a person of color and older. Yes. It's so hard. I think this is something like, working on the agency side where we do the matching and stuff. I struggle with, like, we want nannies to be presented and like get an interview, and then like we don't send photos. And even when I ran my own agency, I never sent photos because I just wanted people's experience and their words and their content to be seen, the content of their character to be seen before any of those social grouping things. Obviously, like, you pretty much know if they're a woman, maybe you can gauge their age on whatever, with like dates of degrees and things. But point is, it's hard if you show up to an interview and a lot of people want to self-disclose because who wants to go and be discriminated against? I think, to answer the question, how can you know? I think there's a couple of things that I would say. One, sometimes it's pretty obvious. I'm sure that you've experienced that, like, because you are a person of color and you've been around, like, when you say older, like I assume you're older than me or my age, or like, you've seen this. So obviously some of it is blazingly obvious. I think that what I've seen nannies do is say really clearly, and then it's not about asking inappropriate questions. It's not about asking a client or a client's beliefs directly, but I share who I am. And I encourage people to do that in a way that is appropriate. And that is for nannies who are watching this, who are like going on interviews like, oh my gosh, I don't want to be an oversharer, right? So I'm going to just hold myself back. I'm not saying to do that or do the inverse. I'm not saying talk too much about who you are and what you believe in all your politics. Like, there is like a separation between, there's definitely a separation and an appropriate time to disclose who you are. And honestly, who you vote for, it is private. And who they vote for is private. So I wouldn't necessarily ask this question, but I wouldn't necessarily self-disclose. What I would say is centering the questions around values. So whatever your philosophical and political value is, especially racism, this is my personal opinion. I don't know if my company would also agree with this, but I saw in a group, a nanny asked this question about, like, what do I say about Black Lives Matter? And I think it's a pretty cool question. If you know that the family, you've had a good vibe, you can say, like, okay, I'm interested in moving forward with them. Hey, tell me about your family. Obviously, you look around and you see that there's a lot of social movements happening. And as you can tell, like, I'm Black, like, or I'm a person of color. And then from there say, what are you teaching your children about racism in this country? What are you teaching your children about history? And you can even say, what are you teaching your children directly or indirectly? What's important to you is maybe a better way to phrase that. Because it takes it from, do you believe in my humanity, that I deserve, me and people who are like me and my descendants, my ancestors, do you believe that we deserve equal treatment under the law? You're not asking that. You're not asking, like, is it right that Black people are 3.1 times more likely to be killed by police? You're not asking them that. I mean, I feel like that's rhetorical, but then there's like, well, what about this? No, you're not asking directly. What you're asking really is how are we moving forward with this together? How does your family envision that? I want to support your family. I want to make sure that the way that the values that I bring to your family support support your family. And then that way, it's not just about you being comfortable, because that's obviously extremely important. But it also demonstrates to the family that you are there as the nanny, that this is still service role, that this is still caring. You're there as that person to support them. And you obviously need to be supported. If you're going through an agency, hopefully they're doing that work to make sure you're like set up for success and support. But you're just phrasing it from like, you know, look, everybody's self-centered. Like if somebody's asking me my opinion or like something like, you know, it's like, oh, this nanny wants to know about me. This nanny cares about me and my family. So phrasing it in that way that's positive, of just how can I support your family on these things? What are you doing? Like you're assuming good faith, right? You're assuming, of course you care about racial justice and equality and respect. You're such a great person. I already get that vibe. But that's the way that I would field it personally, is to not ask directly. I don't want to sound manipulative, but does anybody have anything else that they want to add to that? Like how, I turn it to you guys, like how can a prospective family, like how can we know if a prospective family is aligned and compatible? It comes out, sometimes it comes out a month or two, or for a friend of mine, it came out like 4 or 5 months into the pandemic when they think it's a hoax and like they're not protecting her and the kids. And so it comes out, but screening question wise, a couple interviews in, whatever. Anybody else want to add there? It's tough. It is really tough. Lisa, I love that comment. Thanks for sharing this. Different angles of racism. Yes, we have a lot of work to do to bring real change. We really do. We really do. We have so much work to do. It's a lot. I'm not burdened by it. I'm not overwhelmed. One day at a time. I hope that no one here is overwhelmed as well. But one day at a time. You have to get busy. Yeah. Cool. Kinda, thanks for joining us. Thanks for Rachel and Mara. If you're still on, I'm Shenandoah. I have like 8 more minutes. Not that I have the answers. Does anybody want to share? I have so much. Anybody wants to share anything? Where you are, what you're learning, business-wise or not, like, because I feel like running a business is not who we are. It's a part of us. It's not our identity. If we lost capacity to do this, as some of us have in the start of the pandemic, it's not our identity. It's something that we do. So if you want to share anything business or personal wise that you're learning or wrestling with, that's great too. Okay, I think that we're good. No messages. And I think that's it.
Thank you so much, Krista.
Totally. Absolutely. I'm always here. If you guys need my email, as Julie mentioned, I'm now the first vice president, just stepping in when there was a need. And so it's pretty easy to get in touch with me. These opinions are my own, of course. But obviously INA, like, we have our values of believing in respect and protection for everybody. We're all on the same page. So it's a matter of wrestling and getting there together. So.
Well, thank you so much, Krista. Thank you all for joining us today. Yes, and like Krista said, if you have any questions, please feel free to email the office and we'll be sure to forward them to Krista and we'll get them answered for you. All right, thank you guys. Have a great rest of your day.
You too. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Thanks.